The airport speaker crackled overhead. Attention passengers. Flight 372 to Dallas has been canceled due to severe weather conditions. The reaction was immediate. People groaned. A man slammed his laptop shut. Someone cursed under their breath. Dozens of travelers rushed toward the customer service counter before the announcement had even finished. But one woman stayed exactly where she was. She didn't move. She didn't complain. She didn't even reach for her phone. Instead, she stared at the departure board as her flight number disappeared from the screen. For a moment, her eyes closed, not in frustration, not in defeat, almost as if she was listening for something. Then she whispered 5 words. "Lord, you must know why," and she turned around. 3 weeks later, that decision would change everything. At 46 years old, Rebecca Hayes had become the kind of woman people often overlooked. Not because she wasn't intelligent, not because she wasn't kind, but because she had spent most of her life carrying responsibilities instead of chasing attention. She worked at a regional hospital in Tennessee. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would ever earn headlines. Most people couldn't even explain what her job involved. She spent her days solving problems nobody else wanted to solve. Paperwork, insurance claims, missing records, administrative mistakes. The kind of work people only noticed when it wasn't done correctly. For 18 years, she showed up before sunrise and left after dark. The hospital changed directors. Departments changed, technology changed, but Rebecca remained reliable, quiet, consistent. At home, life had been even harder. She raised her son Ethan alone. There was never enough money, never enough time, never enough energy. But somehow she always found a way to make sure Ethan never felt the weight she carried. When he was 10 years old, she worked double shifts so he could join a science camp. When he was 13, she sold jewelry she inherited from her grandmother to buy him the laptop he needed for school. When he was 16, she spent 6 months driving an unreliable car because the money she saved went toward his college applications. Every sacrifice had a purpose. Every difficult day was connected to a dream, and now that dream was finally arriving. Ethan was graduating from one of the most respected engineering programs in Texas. The ceremony was less than 24 hours away. Rebecca had been counting down to this moment for years, not because she cared about titles, not because she wanted recognition, but because she remembered every night she cried quietly after Ethan went to sleep. Every bill she didn't know how she would pay. Every moment she feared she wasn't enough. The graduation felt like proof that God had carried them through all of it. That was why the canceled flight hurt, not because it ruined a trip, because it felt like it was stealing a moment she could never get back. As she walked through the airport parking garage, she kept expecting herself to become angry. Instead, she felt strangely calm, not happy, not relieved, just calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from understanding. The kind that comes from surrender. The drive home took almost an hour. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. The world outside looked gray and uncertain. Inside the car, Rebecca prayed. Not a polished prayer. Not the kind people post online. Just honesty. God, I don't understand this. Silence. I wanted to be there. More silence. Then she sighed. But you've never failed me before. The words felt heavy. Because trust sounds beautiful until it costs something. And that trust was about to be tested more than she knew. That evening, she called Ethan. The moment he answered, she could hear disappointment in his voice. "Mom!" Rebecca closed her eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan laughed softly. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I was trying to figure out how to comfort you." Rebecca smiled. "I thought I was supposed to comfort you." They both laughed. And for the first time all day, the weight on her chest felt lighter. Neither of them realized that the canceled flight was only the beginning of a story neither could have imagined. The next morning, Rebecca woke before sunrise. Her phone was ringing. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Something made her answer. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded professional. Is this Rebecca Hayes? Yes. My name is Michael Carter. I hope I'm not calling too early. Rebecca sat upright. No, that's all right. We've been trying to reach you. The conversation that followed would alter the course of her life, because while Rebecca believed she had spent 18 years doing invisible work, someone had been paying attention. Someone had noticed the systems she improved, the reports she built, the problems she solved, the ideas she quietly documented while everyone else rushed past them. And now, one of the largest healthcare consulting firms in the country wanted to meet her. Not for an interview, for a leadership position. Rebecca sat frozen as Michael explained the opportunity. The salary alone was more money than she had ever imagined earning. But it wasn't the number that shook her. It was what he said next. We don't want your resume, Rebecca. A pause. We want your experience. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt tears forming, because those words touched a wound she rarely spoke about, a wound carried by millions of ordinary people. The feeling that everything they do goes unnoticed. The feeling that their sacrifices disappear into the background. The fear that all those difficult years never meant anything. And suddenly, God seemed to be answering a question she hadn't even asked aloud. Not with a miracle from the sky, but with recognition, with purpose, with confirmation. The story should have ended there, but it didn't, because 10 days later, something happened that made Rebecca realize the canceled flight wasn't only about opportunity. It was also about protection. A news article appeared online. Most people ignored it. Rebecca almost did too. Then she saw the flight number. Her flight number. The aircraft that never left the ground. The same plane she had been scheduled to board. A maintenance inspection discovered a critical mechanical issue shortly before departure. Investigators later reported that the problem had likely been developing for days. No disaster occurred. No emergency landing. No tragedy. Because the issue was found in time. Rebecca stared at the article for a very long time, not because she believed she had narrowly escaped death, not because she wanted to dramatize what happened, but because something suddenly became clear. The disappointment she spent days questioning, the frustration she struggled to understand, the closed doors she wished had opened, might have been mercy all along. And isn't that how life often works? We beg God to explain the doors He closes. We demand answers. We wrestle with disappointment. Meanwhile, we rarely stop to ask what those closed doors might be protecting us from. Rebecca never got her original plan. She never sat in the seat she reserved. She never experienced the graduation exactly the way she imagined. Instead, she received something better, a future she couldn't see, a purpose she didn't expect, and a reminder she would never forget. Sometimes faith means trusting God when nothing makes sense. And sometimes, years later, you discover that the detour wasn't a mistake. It was the path all along. The offer changed everything, but not in the way people imagine. Most people think blessings arrive with fireworks, with certainty, with immediate clarity. Rebecca discovered that real blessings often arrive carrying questions. Lots of questions. For nearly 2 decades, her life had been predictable. Wake up, go to work, pay bills, take care of responsibilities, repeat. Now suddenly she was staring at an opportunity that could completely rearrange her future. The consulting position would require travel. Eventually, relocation, a different environment, different expectations, different people. Everything familiar would disappear. That frightened her more than she wanted to admit. For several days, she carried the offer around like a stone in her pocket, always aware of it, never fully comfortable. Everywhere she went, the decision followed her. At work, she found herself staring at spreadsheets without reading them. At the grocery store, she stood in front of shelves longer than necessary. Even during church, she struggled to focus. Her mind kept returning to the same question: what if I make the wrong choice? One evening, she sat alone on her porch. The Tennessee summer air was warm. Crickets filled the darkness. A distant train horn echoed across town, and for the first time since receiving the offer, she allowed herself to admit what was really bothering her. It wasn't fear of failure. It was fear of leaving behind the version of herself she had spent years becoming. There is something strange about growth. People pray for change. Then when change arrives, they mourn what it replaces. Rebecca had spent 18 years becoming dependable, steady, necessary. Everyone at the hospital knew her. Everyone trusted her. She knew where every hallway led. She knew which computers froze every Tuesday. She knew which coworkers were secretly struggling even when they smiled. She belonged there. The thought of starting over felt exhausting. Yet deep inside she sensed something. A gentle pressure, not forcing, not demanding, simply inviting. The same feeling she experienced years earlier when she sent Ethan away to college. The same feeling she experienced when she bought her first home, despite barely having enough savings. The same feeling she experienced whenever God was asking her to walk somewhere before she could see the destination. 3 nights later, Ethan called. He had already attended graduation, accepted his diploma, taken photographs, celebrated with friends. But something in his voice sounded different. "Mom? Yeah? Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If I told you I was afraid to accept an opportunity because it felt too big, what would you tell me?" Rebecca laughed softly. "You've already accepted opportunities bigger than you." "I know. So have you." The conversation stopped her because she immediately understood what he was doing. Ethan wasn't asking for advice. He was giving it. "You think I should take the job. I think you've spent your whole life teaching me to trust God." Silence. Then he continued, "And now I think he's asking you to trust him too." Rebecca looked out into the darkness beyond her porch. The words landed deeper than either of them expected. Children rarely realize how often they become mirrors, reflecting lessons back toward the people who taught them. For years, she had encouraged Ethan whenever he doubted himself. Now those same lessons were returning home. A week later, she accepted the offer, not because all her fears disappeared, not because every question had an answer, because faith isn't certainty. Faith is movement. Faith is taking the next step when certainty hasn't arrived yet. The months that followed moved faster than she imagined. Her final day at the hospital arrived sooner than expected. The people stopped by her office one after another. Some brought cards. Others brought small gifts. Several brought stories. Stories she had never heard before. One coworker described how Rebecca helped her through a difficult divorce. Another remembered how she stayed late to help fix a problem that wasn't technically her responsibility. A department manager admitted that an entire project succeeded because Rebecca quietly corrected mistakes before anyone else noticed them. By the end of the day, Rebecca realized something surprising. Most of her impact had happened in places she never measured. Not reports, not performance reviews, not promotions. People, lives, moments. Conversations, small acts of kindness repeated over years. The things that rarely appear on resumes. As she carried the final box to her car, an elderly janitor stopped her near the parking lot. He had worked there almost as long as she had. His name was Walter. Most employees barely noticed him. Rebecca always greeted him, always learned the names of his grandchildren, always asked how he was doing. Walter smiled, then said something she would remember forever. God doesn't promote people because they're ready. Rebecca tilted her head. Walter chuckled. He promotes them because he's ready. Then he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot, thinking. Months later, Rebecca would still repeat those words, because they explained something she had struggled to understand. Many of us spend years trying to prepare ourselves for the future. But sometimes God spends those same years preparing the future for us. The consulting firm turned out to be everything Michael promised, and nothing she expected. For the first time in her career, people listened when she spoke. Not politely, not out of obligation. They genuinely wanted her insight. The experience she spent years dismissing as ordinary suddenly became valuable. Problems she solved effortlessly were challenges others couldn't untangle. Patterns noticed she immediately took teams weeks to identify. Again and again, Rebecca found herself sitting in conference rooms, thinking the same thing. I've known this for years. The knowledge wasn't new, the environment was. The difference wasn't her capability. The difference was where God placed her. That realization changed how she viewed her entire past. Maybe the years hadn't been wasted. Maybe the waiting wasn't punishment. Maybe God hadn't forgotten her. Maybe he had simply been building something she couldn't yet see. One Friday afternoon, nearly 6 months after the canceled flight, Rebecca found herself alone in a hotel room during a business trip. The city lights glowed outside the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The room was quiet, too quiet. For the first time in weeks, she finally slowed down enough to think. Her life looked completely different now. Different income, different opportunities, different future. Yet something unexpected happened. She missed the old days. Not because they were easier, because they were familiar. Growth always costs something. Even good growth. Even blessed growth. You don't just gain a new future. You say goodbye to an old one. Rebecca sat beside the window and opened her Bible, not searching for answers, just seeking peace. Her eyes settled on a verse she had read dozens of times. But this night it felt different. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. She smiled, because suddenly the entire story made sense. Not the mechanics, not every detail, not every reason, but the lesson, the flight, the disappointment, the opportunity, the protection, the uncertainty, the promotion. All of it pointed back to one simple truth. God never asked her to understand everything, only to trust him. And maybe that's the hardest lesson for all of us. We want explanations. God often offers guidance. We want details. God offers direction. We want guarantees. God offers his presence, and for those willing to walk forward anyway, that becomes enough. Years later, when people asked Rebecca about the biggest turning point of her life, they expected her to mention the promotion, the salary, the career change, the success. She never did. Instead, she always smiled and said the same thing. It started with a canceled flight. People usually laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. Because sometimes the moment that changes your life doesn't look like a blessing. Sometimes it looks exactly like a disappointment. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a delay, a rejection, a closed door, a canceled plan, a prayer that wasn't answered the way you hoped. And that's why so many people miss what God is doing. They leave too early, they quit too soon, they decide the story is over, while God is still writing the next chapter. Rebecca almost did, but she chose trust. One small decision, one quiet prayer, one moment of surrender in a crowded airport. And because of that, she eventually discovered something beautiful. The flight wasn't the story. The cancellation wasn't the story. The story was that God was already working before she knew she needed him to. He always was, he always had been, and he still is. About a year after the canceled flight, Rebecca received a message she never expected. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. No dramatic timing, no special occasion, just an email waiting quietly in her inbox. The sender's name didn't look familiar at first. She almost deleted it. Then she opened it and froze. The message was from a young woman named Claire. Rebecca read the first line twice. "You don't know me, but your son changed my life." She leaned back in her chair, confused, curious. Then she kept reading. Claire had attended the same university as Ethan. Different major, different social circle, different life. During her sophomore year, she lost her father unexpectedly. The grief crushed her. Her grades collapsed. Her friendships disappeared. She stopped attending classes regularly. Eventually, she decided to leave school. Not temporarily, forever. Nobody knew. Nobody noticed. At least that's what she believed. Until one afternoon, Ethan sat beside her in the library. Not because they were close friends. Not because he was trying to impress anyone. Simply because he saw someone hurting. For nearly 3 hours they talked. About loss, about fear, about faith, about the future, about God, about the temptation to quit when life becomes unbearable. Claire wrote that she had never forgotten that conversation, not once, because it happened on the exact day she planned to submit withdrawal papers. Instead, she stayed, finished the semester, finished the year, finished her degree, and now she was working as a pediatric nurse, helping children every day. At the bottom of the email was a final sentence. One sentence, simple, powerful. "If Ethan hadn't sat beside me that afternoon, I honestly don't know where my life would be today." Rebecca sat motionless. Tears slowly filled her eyes, not because of the email itself, because suddenly she understood something. All those years, all those sacrifices, all those difficult nights, none of them had stopped with Ethan. Everything she poured into him had continued moving outward, touching people she would never meet, changing lives she would never see. That realization humbled her more than any promotion ever could. We often imagine God's work as something large, something public, something obvious. But more often than not, God's greatest work travels quietly through people. A lesson passed from mother to son, a conversation passed from son to stranger, a stranger who eventually helps hundreds of children, and suddenly one act of faith becomes impossible to measure. Rebecca printed the email, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her Bible. Years later, it remained there, a reminder, not of success, not of achievement, but of impact. Because impact and success are not always the same thing. A few months after receiving the message, Rebecca visited Ethan. By then, he was fully established in his career, confident, independent, building a life of his own, something every parent wants and secretly fears. That evening, they sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold across the horizon. Neither spoke for a while. Then Ethan finally broke the silence. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Rebecca smiled. "What?" "The flight." She laughed. "You're still thinking about that?" "Sometimes." He looked toward the fading sunlight, then said something she wasn't expecting. "I don't think God canceled that flight for the job." Rebecca turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "I think the job was part of it." He shrugged. "But I think he canceled it because he wanted to teach us something." Rebecca waited. Ethan continued. "We spent years believing faith meant trusting God when things went right." A pause. "The flight taught us how to trust him when things went wrong." The words settled over both of them because they were true. Anyone can praise God when prayers are answered immediately. Anyone can trust when the road is smooth. The real test comes when disappointment arrives, when plans collapse, when doors close, when answers don't come. That is where faith becomes real, not theoretical, not inspirational, real. The sun slowly disappeared below the horizon. Darkness crept across the yard, and Rebecca found herself remembering that day at the airport. The noise, the confusion, the cancellation announcement, the frustration all around her. She could still see it clearly. One small moment, one decision, one prayer. At the time it seemed insignificant. Now it felt sacred. Because looking back, she could finally see what she couldn't see then. God had been present in every chapter. Not just the happy ones, not just the successful ones. Every chapter. The lonely years, the struggling years, the waiting years, the uncertain years, the breakthrough years. All of them. And maybe that's the message someone needs to hear right now. Maybe you're waiting for a door to open. Maybe you're staring at a disappointment you don't understand. Maybe you're watching a plan fall apart after praying about it for months. Maybe you're standing exactly where Rebecca stood, wondering why, wondering when, wondering what God is doing. If that's you, remember this. The closed door is not proof that God abandoned you. The delay is not proof that He forgot you. The detour is not proof that you're lost. Sometimes God protects you through what He prevents. Sometimes He guides you through what He removes. Sometimes the greatest blessing begins with a disappointment that makes no sense at all. And sometimes, years later, you look back and realize something extraordinary. The thing you begged God to change was actually the thing He used to change you. Rebecca Hayes never became famous. She never wrote a book. She never built a platform. Most people will never hear her story. But that doesn't matter, because the value of a life isn't measured by how many people know your name. It's measured by what happens because you were here. A son who learned faith, a stranger who found hope, a career that finally found purpose, a life redirected by grace, and one canceled flight that became a reminder she carried forever. God sees farther than we do, farther than our plans, farther than our fears, farther than our understanding. And when we cannot see the road ahead, we can still trust the one who already stands at the end of it. So if you're facing a closed door today, don't assume the story is over. You may only be standing at the end of one chapter, while God is quietly preparing the next, and it may become the chapter that changes everything.